I'm here in Queens, New York City, and we have a little cross-coastal trip with Shahid Buttar. You're running in for Congress against Speaker Pelosi. She hasn't had a real threat, I'd say, congressionally for 30 years. Obviously, much of her national profile right now is involved with impeachment, so there hasn't been that much national coverage that she's got a challenger. So first for the audience, you're a constitutional attorney. You've been a longtime activist on the front lines in San Francisco, which I'm sure if you're watching from San Francisco or just in a gentrified city, you will know San Francisco is much different than it was 20 years ago. Yes. And Speaker Pelosi has kind of been the representative as the gentrification has gone on. So for people who don't know you or your background, what kind of prompted you to take on the most powerful Democrat in the country?
I'm a longtime advocate for communities on a whole range of issues, and frankly, I just got tired of waiting for my elected congressional representative to show up for the interests that I as a San Franciscan care about. 15 years ago, I was part of a mass movement around the world, frankly, marching in the streets to try to stop an invasion that she chose to support and to fund. And in the years since, I've seen her sweep CIA torture under the rug, support Obama's deportations, support Trump's foreign policy, fund his concentration camps, impose conservative spending austerity rules on a House, delay on impeachment, and then show up with a limited inquiry that I think is designed to fail. And I'm basically tired of waiting for corporate Democrats to show up for work, and that's why I chose to challenge Pelosi and give my city a more sincere, faithful representation of our visionary values in Congress.
And the nitty-gritty, you actually, this is your second time running, you kind of just like, somewhat last minute, 3 months before the primary, 2 years ago, 2018, you decided to run, and you almost made the runoff, actually. In California, it's the top two candidates in the primary. Right. So you did pretty well for announcing 3 months before a primary. Yeah. So you're running this time, I don't want to compare it too much to the Ocasio-Cortez race, but you have a powerful Democrat who's probably not taking a primary challenger that seriously. Right. Can you kind of give people a lens of how you've seen San Francisco change? Yeah. Because you have obviously Silicon Valley, just a damaging machete it's taken to native San Franciscans. Yes. That people in Seattle and Chicago, Los Angeles, other West Coast areas know. I mean, you can't live in San Francisco right now, and it would be hard to live in San Francisco, even if with a good salary.
Yeah. Housing insecurity is a problem that plagues many generations of people, and it's not confined to San Francisco, though we do have a particularly pernicious experience with it. And frankly, the cause of our urban housing crisis around the country has a federal root, and the Speaker of the House, unfortunately, has been entirely complicit in the erosion of federal spending on affordable housing. And I see in San Francisco just one example of a problem that is much more widespread. The idea of establishing a right to housing, investing in public housing, ensuring that people who face eviction, like they do here in New York and in San Francisco, have a right to civil representation funded with our tax dollars. Those are opportunities that we have to at least condition the vagaries of the market and ultimately ensure that housing is not something that only wealthy people can have security. And I'll give you this reflection on it. I've lived in San Francisco on and off for about 20 years. And in the course of those 20 years, I've lived in almost every neighborhood on the east side of the city. And when I often visit people's homes, you said, I've lived here for 5 or 6 years. I've never had, in the last several years, I think the opportunity to be anywhere more than a few. And that's the experience of renters. And to see a city become inhospitable to longtime residents is, I think, an experience that will spread across the country to communities that haven't experienced it yet. And I heard this explained just the other day through these terms. Because we allocate housing and because we build housing only according to the market, we always lag. As migration moves in response to job opportunities, the market to build housing always lags the demand, as opposed to preceding it, as you can in an economy where you actually have planning as opposed to after-the-fact response signals. The last thing I'd say here is you mentioned my 2018 run and the 2020 run. and the comparison to someone by whom I'm very inspired, Representative Ocasio-Cortez. And we ran in 2018 in the same cycle on very much the same platform, and I got as many votes in our primary in San Francisco as she did here in New York. And I'm back this year to finish the job. We've raised $250,000 already from over 6,500 supporters around the country. Endorsements are rolling in. We've been endorsed by People for Bernie, national grassroots organization, as well as Veterans for Bernie and Bay Area for Bernie. Been endorsed by the California Progressive Alliance, a statewide network of progressives across political parties in California. Been endorsed by DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, San Francisco, and an expanding body of national leaders, internet luminaries like Cory Doctorow and Lawrence Lessig, community luminaries like Gladys Limon, who heads the California Environmental Justice Alliance, Medea Benjamin, who founded Code Pink, Women for Peace, and then several members of our board of former members of our board of supervisors, Eric Marr, Matt Gonzalez, who was very nearly our mayor in 2003. And given all of the expanding support and the year we have left to build the campaign, I'm very confident that we'll have a chance to liberate San Francisco's voice in Washington.
You know, it's interesting to me, obviously Speaker Pelosi wields the most power of any Democrat. If she wanted to embrace this youth movement going on around the country, if she wanted to embrace the progressive surge going on around this country, 5 years ago, I don't think anyone would have thought Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders would be polling, you know, in a lot of polls, 2 and 3, 1 and 2. If she wanted to do those things and embrace this shift, she could easily do it.
She could.
But recently she keeps saying, well, I think the Affordable Care Act is a better benefit than Medicare for all, not providing any facts to back that up.
Yeah.
She's called the Green New Deal the Green New Dream. Or whatever. Yeah. And she's also essentially talked more about, you know, the Electoral College. We need to win the Electoral College, even though this neoliberal strategy is why we have President Trump. I mean, Nancy Pelosi obviously was simpatico with Hillary Clinton, and this illusionary Midwest voter who wants a moderate Democrat to right-wing. So what are you, obviously we know you're offering an entirely different thing, but to people watching, why do you think that is, that Speaker Pelosi is doing that? Is it fear? Is it complete out-of-touchness with her district? Why is it that she's basically intentionally going against the political winds?
I think that it reflects the same reason, frankly, why we're going to take the seat, and it's just generational attitudes and predilections. And she came up in an era, the Reagan era, and I think her attitudes and her construction of reality, her assessment of the political landscape is all inflected by an era that, frankly, we have thankfully shrugged off years ago. And I see a timidity across her various positions. And the healthcare debate is one good example where she has been unwilling to embrace the opportunity to establish healthcare as a human right in the United States. We have the money for it. Most of it's in the Pentagon. You know, there's never been a war or a weapons program that she hasn't liked. And so it challenges her implicit presumptions. And I think that's why she's been unable to respond to the times.
Which I should note, 20 years ago, she, on the Capitol Hill, was pushing for single payer.
She used to be a visionary, and I think she came to Congress with a bright vision, and I think that some combination of the partisan challenges that she confronted, the limits of what she internalized to be possible, and frankly the limits of the generational landscape at the time constrained that vision. And I see what I was going to cite a different example. One of the first things I had an opportunity to do when I first graduated from law school in 2003 was file and organize the first set of lawsuits vindicating the right of consenting adults to marry the partner of their choice. Here in the state of New York, I represented Jason West, who was a small-town Green Party mayor of New Paltz, New York. And at the time, Speaker Pelosi was quite influential. In fact, a few years later, she was the Speaker of the House. And at no point during that time, even as the most powerful Democrat in the country, with the exception of the president at the time, did she see fit to show up for the rights of my neighbors. And as a cis-hetero Muslim fighting for the rights of LGBT communities, the gulf between our respective willingnesses to champion hard issues could not be more stark, because she, with all the institutional privilege we might want to see in someone, refused to show up until the eve of a decision by a right-wing Supreme Court, which basically obviated the need for her support. And I, as a relatively powerless young lawyer, was fighting that pitched battle in the courts early in that struggle. And whether it's Medicare for all, whether it's challenging the military-industrial complex, in which she's thoroughly complicit, the mass surveillance regime, which she's helped architect, I see her on issue after issue unwilling to embrace the future and entirely too willing to defend a failed predatory past.
And also, Nancy Pelosi has talked about, as Speaker, The Democratic Party, our issues are health care and, fighting for the middle class and this and that.
Right.
But meanwhile, I mean, when
photo ops.
through photo ops, but meanwhile, I mean, Bernie Sanders is the only one talking about it on the debate stage. Yep. You got 500,000 people sleeping on the streets tonight, maybe more now. A lot of them are in San Francisco. And the major thing that people don't understand, because I've seen it, most of these people, a lot of these people are working. A lot of these people are working but still can't afford rent in San Francisco, Seattle, this and that.
That's right.
And I don't really see her talking about those things. I also don't really see her talking about, the fact that why was Trump elected in the first place? Right. Things like NAFTA, TPP, yes, we could get into Russia and Ukraine, and there's validity definitely to Ukraine. But, I mean, they act like, oh, this was just a foreign government is why he got elected. It has nothing to do with Speaker Pelosi and the Democratic Party's failed vision.
Right. I think that's exactly the response we should expect from careerists trying to protect their position. And ultimately, that's what corporate Democrats are. They are careerists who are putting their own individual interests and the interests of their patrons before the interests of the country and we the people of the United States. And healthcare is a perfect example of that. We could have a healthcare system that treats healthcare like a human right, or we could have a healthcare system like the one we have, which is a predatory, corporate, extractive, industrial engine that treats sickness like an opportunity to drive people into bankruptcy and into the street. Right? Many homeless people are working and can't afford homes. Many homeless people are homeless simply because they got sick. Medical bankruptcy is the leading cause of both bankruptcy and homelessness, and I think that is absolutely shameful for us all as a society. And it's particularly shameful for the architects of the predatory paradigm who refuse to embrace the future, like corporate Democrats and their leader, who I plan to replace next year. The further thing I'd say here with respect particularly to the seemingly relentless focus on the figure of the president, omitting their own role in creating the preconditions that enabled his rise. The corporate Democrats are very eager to construct a narrative that places them in the position of defending the country's interests, even if that shoe doesn't fit. And the only way to make it seem to fit is to position themselves as the antithesis to kleptocracy. And we do have a president who is relentless about taking the tax dollars of the American people and putting them in his pocket. That is particularly an issue that she has refused to bring forward as part of the impeachment inquiry. The violations of the emoluments clause. This is a clause in the Constitution that prohibits self-enrichment at public expense. This criminal president has been enriching himself at public expense since the first day he took office. And the idea that it would take the speaker a year after becoming the speaker to show up for a limited process during which any number of kids have been torn from their mothers, during which any number of people have been shot by right-wing extremists inspired by his vile, hateful, criminal rhetoric. These are incalculable costs that have already passed under the bridge. And now with a limited inquiry, paying attention only to the Ukraine incident, which, let's to be fair, it is a crime to invite foreign interference in an election, yes. The issue that is most likely to flip Republican votes in the Senate is the one that most enrages the Republican base, and that is corruption, full stop. And there's no figure in Washington, even despite the bounty of corruption that we witness in the corporate Democratic Party, there is no figure in Washington as corrupt as our criminal president. And going after corruption is the way to ensure executive accountability. And I think one of the reasons Speaker Pelosi has been reticent to pursue that line of inquiry is that corruption in Washington is, sadly, a thoroughly bipartisan phenomenon. And that's exactly why I plan to replace her next year, to help clean house, to bring a vision supporting the American people over corporations, and to challenge the executive branch in Congress.
And I also want the audience to know you've kind of been on the leading for years, fighting against bad tech, privacy issues, surveillance, things like that. Yeah. I think right now, I mean, I kind of think Google just owns the world between search rankings, suppression, YouTube censorship, Facebook, we know of all the problems with them. Can you kind of talk about your background in fighting, mass surveillance and against these invasions of privacy?
Thank you so much for that question. I worked at the Electronic Frontier Foundation for the last 4 years. It's the world's largest and heaviest hitting digital civil liberties group. And in that context, I had an opportunity to both build a national grassroots network of nearly 100 organizations in 30 states around the country that are building the movement for digital individual rights in their respective spaces. I also advocated particularly for limits on police surveillance at the local level around the country. One of the most recent high watermarks in that movement I'm very excited about in San Francisco this spring, I had a chance to advocate for the nation's first municipal ban on the use of face recognition and surveillance technology in the hands of government agencies, including police departments. And that local victory has already inspired a national debate that is underway in Congress. And frankly, I'd love to see Speaker Pelosi show up for our city's declared interests in that issue. Just like, frankly, I'd love to see her show up for our city's declared interests in Medicare for All, which our Board of Supervisors has embraced a resolution for. Other ways I fought surveillance, just to lay this out there, for 6 years before I worked for EFF, I led a national nonprofit organization known at the time as the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. I'm now on the board of his successor organization called Defending Rights and Dissent. And we not only fight police surveillance at the local level, we also are particularly concerned about intelligence agencies at the federal level undermining dissent. And that's the lens that I would offer people to understand surveillance through. Yes, surveillance offends privacy. It is, frankly, the least of the values offended by government surveillance. The value I am concerned about is dissent, because we need it for democracy. It's not surveillance, pardon me, it's not privacy that surveillance most offends. It's democracy that surveillance most offends. And I am a democracy activist. My aim ultimately is to democratize a country that falsely thinks it is free and foolishly thinks it is brave, while we are being preyed upon relentlessly, not only by some of the corporations you mentioned, and I would single out Facebook as a particularly bad actor in the big tech landscape. Maybe just a brief digression there. One of the particular issues that Facebook's been called out recently for is its practice of inviting politicians to pay for false facts to be promoted on the platform. And we know that Facebook has developed one of the world's most addictive brain attention capture machines. And it's one thing to allow politicians to post whatever they want. That would be consistent with the First Amendment. But to accept our money to promote fake news undermines our democracy. So our response, when Facebook's policy went in the news, I guess it was probably 2 weeks ago now, we put together a satirical advertisement, a fake ad, if you will, thanking Speaker Pelosi for giving away all of her many mansions and her Napa Valley vineyard to homeless people to house them in the midst of this housing crisis. And we close it with a vignette noting that Facebook invites politicians to enlarge its pockets by undermining our democracy by peddling fake news.
You should write for The Onion.
Yeah, well, it felt very much like that. It was like hit Speaker Pelosi's, the frankly untenable and unjustifiable wealth in the hands of policymakers, as well as the housing crisis, as well as Facebook's irresponsible decisions with respect to our democracy, all at once. And the power of satire and art is another thing I'm very compelled by. I'm a poet and a DJ and an MC, and so I've been inspired very much, and I'm able to use some very novel outreach opportunities on account of my history as an artist and a lawyer and an advocate and an organizer. And that's the multiplicity of those opportunities, the way they intersect, the history of my resistance to surveillance, and the depth I can offer the squad in Congress on constitutional issues are all more reasons why I'm very confident that we'll have a chance to surprise a lot of people next fall.
And last question, because I know we have it there. Shahid has an event with supporters and other congressional candidates starting in a few minutes. I want to ask you a national question.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at 2016, which was more like the Bernie blackout, now it's just like the Bernie beating. I mean, it's literally from corporate media. First they propped up Senator Harris. That didn't work out. Then they kind of moved to Beto. That failed. Then Biden came in, so they thought he was going to save them. Biden obviously has stumbled and then some. I think they've, I don't think she's certainly not as bad as Trump or Biden or any, but they've definitely give kind of nice slobbering coverage to Senator Warren. And they've basically tried to either erase Bernie, or obviously they thought his health issue might bring him down.
Or alternatively, they weaponized it to try to bring him down.
Right.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, you look at Bernie, obviously their strategy is to try and bring out a lot of non-voters, create this youth mobilization. What do you think in terms of the national race? Because the media is trying as best as they can to have a neoliberal survive and become the nominee.
I think you're absolutely right. I see the parade of centrist careerists as an attempt by the corporate cabal to preserve its position. And the same way that Speaker Pelosi ensures that the focus stays on the president instead of the failure of corporate Democrats to meet the needs of the American people, I think that for the same reasons, the Democratic Party and corporate media are aiming to place people who are very deferential to the status quo at the top of the ticket, even to the point at which you'll see polls in which Bernie will be in like second place, and they'll name in the headline the first and third place people. They'll just write him out of the story entirely. And we shouldn't be surprised. These are ultimately corporate outlets that have their own interests and their own shareholders. To even describe them as news, I think, stretches the facts, because they are exposing themselves ultimately as more like propaganda than what we would expect news to be. And my proof in the pudding here, I would just encourage people to wait until the primaries. I have a great deal of confidence in our next president. I'm very proud as a Muslim American to support the first Jewish president, knowing that our interests transcend any faith, they transcend our generation, they transcend the color of our skin, they transcend where we're from, and they unite us as people committed to human rights. And that's why I'm so excited about Bernie Sanders' candidacy, why I was so inspired by him in 2016. My run in 2018 was very directly related to his run in 2016. I saw Bernie do two things that inspired me and educated me. One of them was he demonstrated that the perspective that we share, placing human rights before corporate profit, is not an isolated commitment. It's one that many Americans share, and it took Bernie to help expose that, despite the suppression by the corporate media of that idea. There's a further thing that Bernie did in 2016, and that was demonstrate how to run a political campaign in a way that builds and supports and amplifies and feeds social movements instead of extracting energy from them and bleeding them dry. And our campaign has been rooted in the very same demonstrated solidarity that fuels his campaign. There has not been a labor strike in San Francisco that we have not participated in solidarity with the workers since we launched. There has not been a climate justice action that we have not actively supported and been a part of. There's not been a mobilization for Medicare for all, at least at some scale, that we haven't participated in and helped build. And our actions to help close the camps, to defend human rights in crisis, to expand human rights, to include healthcare, housing, food. These are the ways that we're demonstrating solidarity with not just working class San Franciscans, but all of the people of the United States. Frankly, I dare say all of the people of the world. And maybe I'd leave that as a closing note. One of the reasons I'm so inspired by Bernie, and it's not just me and it's not just us here in the United States, there is a global movement inspired by Bernie Sanders here, because they recognize that in the land of neo-imperial resource plunder, with a military-industrial complex that has been relentlessly warring on the world for generations, a voice is emerging to place human rights at the center. And I think the whole world, frankly, wants to see Bernie win, because we, the people of the earth, need to restrain the climate crisis. That is a shared species-wide imperative, which is why it's one reason why I'm so committed to Bernie. It's one reason why I think so many people around the country are committed to Bernie. And I think it's why so many people around the world want to see him be our next president.
And where can the audience, people, find out more about you, your campaign?
Right on. You can visit us on any of the social media platforms at Shahid for Change, or on the web at shahidforchange.us.
And that's SHAHID.
Yep. FORCHANGE.US.
Cool. I'll let you get to your supporters. Thank you.
Immigrant to the United States, without a family legacy, I don't own any property. The idea that I'm in a position to challenge the most prolific corporate fundraiser in the country is a testament not to me, but to us